Greetings, class, and welcome back to our discussion of American imperialism. I just want to make a note that this video will primarily focus on the presidency of William McKinley. However, it's going to be pretty much focused on imperialism. All right, just remember McKinley is a president during the Progressive era. And he's sort of in that border between the Gilded Age and the Progressive era, but really he's going to be most associated with imperialism. All right, so he's a Republican. He's elected to 2 terms, right? So he's elected in 1896 and reelected in 1900, but he's really going to be a 1-term president. He gets assassinated in 1901, which would be the first year of his 2nd term. Again, we're going to focus mostly on imperialism with him, but we'll look at his whole presidency. So the Newlands Resolution, this is basically how the U.S. gets Hawaii. So I mentioned in the previous video that Alfred Thayer Mahan was an advocate of the U.S. acquisition of Hawaii. So that happens during the presidency of McKinley. Hawaii was a monarchy. It was ruled by a monarch. There was a revolution in Hawaii, and it became a republic, which did not last very long, and then it was annexed into the United States with the Newlands Resolution. McKinley also signs the Gold Standard Act. So this is something we talked about a lot in previous videos, the gold standard. So by signing the Gold Standard Act, it defined the US dollar by gold weight and required the Treasury to redeem paper currency in gold upon demand. So it's pretty significant. You could exchange US dollars for gold, which meant there wouldn't be a lot of money in circulation because every dollar bill out there had to be accounted for by gold. All right, so this is where we're really going to get into the imperialism, right? Now, Hawaii could be considered imperialism, but obviously Hawaii is a state today. But as far as overseas colonies go, right, this is where we really get into it. So the Cuban War for Independence, all right, Cuban War for Independence begins in 1895, all right? So the word here, you see Cuban nationalism. All right, we're going to talk more about nationalism later in this section, but nationalism basically means that those people want to be ruled by those people. They want a nation of their own people, ruled or governed by their people. So Cubans want to be ruled by Cubans rather than being ruled by the Spanish. All right, so this is at the decline of the Spanish Empire. If you had U.S. History Part 1, you would know that at one point Spain was the most powerful nation in the world. They've obviously fallen far from that title at this point, but they still have some colonies out there, and Cuba's one of them. So these Cuban nationalists are fighting for their independence. This is primarily a guerrilla war, and there is American support. And we'll see how the imperialists use this to their advantage. All right, so a term we need to learn is yellow journalism. Yellow journalism is today, in the political climate we live in today, we'll hear a term a lot called fake news. People say, oh, that's fake news, this is fake news. Yellow journalism is fake news, okay? So fake or exaggerated news designed to provoke an emotional response. All right, the point is to get readers, riled up by the news, and then demand some type of political action. So we talked in a previous video about muckrakers. Muckrakers were trying to get readers riled up and demand political action. Yellow journalism can be muckraking, but in this case, the news is not always being honest. All right. So in the context of the Spanish-American War, we have a lot of yellow journalists, right? A lot of these muckrakers publishing fake accounts of Spanish atrocities, basically talking about how bad the Spanish are treating these Cubans with the hope that Americans would demand some kind of action. All right, so there's gaining popular support for war with Spain through this yellow journalism. And then in February of 1898, we have the sinking of the USS Maine. The USS Maine was a battleship that it was stationed in Havana Harbor. Now you might wonder, why in the world is there a battleship, an American battleship, in Cuba while this war is going on? The answer is that it was there to protect American interests. However, some people have looked at this as a possible conspiracy to potentially get the U.S. involved in the war. We're not going to look, too deep into conspiracies in this class, but it is something to keep in mind that has been suggested. Regardless, all right, we know that the battleship gets sank, and a bunch of U.S. servicemen get killed, which leads to a declaration of war. So just to make a note of that, because it's the first time it's happened in this class, this is the third declaration of war, the first being the War of 1812, the second being the Mexican-American War. This is the first declaration of war we're talking about in this course, but the third in American history. This is how the Constitution says that the U.S. has to go to war. So the president, who is the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, must ask Congress, which represents the people of the United States, for a declaration of war. So it's a difficult process to go to war according to the Constitution. Sadly, we have not followed this process in quite some time, but the idea being that the people must support the war, and the guy in charge of the military must also support the war. So the president and Congress have to work together to make that happen, which they do in April of 1898. All right, now, so this is a declaration of war. So now we have what's called the Spanish-American War. However, all right, this needs to be mentioned. In the previous video, we talked about the Anti-Imperialist League. So notice the year, 1898. That's the same year the Anti-Imperialist League was created. So there are people in America who are against imperialism, and they believe this war is just a ruse for the U.S. to get involved in imperialism. They think that this declaration of war, and even maybe the sinking of the Maine, as we mentioned, is all part of this bigger conspiracy for us to get overseas colonies. So as an amendment to the declaration of war, all right, we have something called the Teller Amendment. It says that, yes, we can go to war with Spain. Yes, we will help Cuba win its independence, but the U.S. cannot have Cuba, right? So this is sort of an anti-imperialist amendment to this declaration. It says, okay, if we want to go to war with Spain and we want to help Cuba get its independence, then we're going to do just that. And when it's all said and done, Cuba will be free and independent. It will not belong to the United States. All right, so that's important to know, okay? So, Spanish-American War. If you look, it does not last very long, all right? It lasts less than a year. In fact, McKinley refers to it as a splendid little war. There's basically two theaters of war. The probably lesser known theater is the Pacific Theater, which takes place in the Philippines and Guam. The most famous battle of that theater is the Battle of Manila Bay, where George Dewey defeats Spanish naval forces in the Philippines. And then probably the better known theater of war, the Caribbean Theater, which takes place in the Caribbean, so Cuba and Puerto Rico. The most famous battle from that theater is the Battle of San Juan Hill, which is interestingly named because the hill was actually called Kettle Hill, but San Juan Hill sounds more exotic. But the Battle of San Juan Hill from July of 1898 in Cuba, this is where Teddy Roosevelt's Rough Riders became famous. So Teddy Roosevelt, when we last mentioned Teddy Roosevelt, okay, he was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. He resigned from that position. Remember, we mentioned that Roosevelt he was ashamed of the fact his father avoided service in the Civil War, and so Roosevelt always tried to overcompensate for that um, through various, aspects of things considered masculine, whether it's hunting or boxing or something like that. Um, but when this war starts up, he wants to be part of the war, but he's really too old at this point to do that. But what he does is he ends up joining a regiment with a lot of other um, guys who are like himself, typically from rich families, outdoorsmen. They like to hunt, they like to camp, they like to ride. And so they create this thing called the Rough Riders. Now, the Rough Riders is actually the first U.S. volunteer cavalry United States Army. So they belong to the Army, but they're volunteers. And Roosevelt is a member of that. And you can see his picture there if you look at that American flag and you go straight down from the flag and you see the guy wearing the suspenders in the dark shirt with the light colored suspenders. That is Teddy Roosevelt. He does win the Medal of Honor for his actions in this battle, although it is something that is awarded to him way later, long after his death. So it's a posthumous medal. All right, so the war ends with the Treaty of Paris. A very short discussion of a war here, but it is a short war. So Treaty of Paris of 1898 ends the Spanish-American War. Cuba gets its independence as promised. We do not take Cuba, but we get other colonies. So we don't get Cuba, but we do get Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. So the imperialists still end up accomplishing some of their goals of overseas colonies by obtaining these other places, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. And you're probably familiar, Puerto Rico and Guam are both U.S. territories to this day. And so this is really seen as the end of the Spanish Empire. All right, now, remember, the Teller Amendment said that the U.S. couldn't take Cuba. We couldn't annex Cuba. However, 1901, there is something called the Platt Amendment. And what it does is it basically restricts Cuba's sovereignty. All right. So it essentially says that Cuba cannot sign treaties with other nations without the U.S.'s consent. It allows the U.S. to intervene in Cuba to preserve independence and economic stability, and it leases Guantanamo Bay to the U.S. as a naval base. So even today, when Cuba is not a friendly nation to the United States, we still have a naval base in Cuba at Guantanamo Bay. So even though we didn't take Cuba, legally, it's not part of the United States. From this point until the 1950s, Cuba will be pretty much under the influence of the U.S. government. Some people would even refer to Cuba as a puppet state during this period. We don't legally own Cuba, but we pull the strings, sort of behind the scenes. All right, now, transitioning from the Spanish-American War, we pretty much roll right into the Philippine-American War. So, like in Cuba, where the Cubans were fighting for independence, the Filipinos were fighting for their independence as well from Spain. All right. However, unlike Cuba, where it was said we could not take Cuba, there was no rule that said we couldn't take the Philippines. So the Philippines goes, directly from being a Spanish colony to being an American colony. All right. And so the Filipinos go from fighting the Spanish to fighting the United States. All right. So we call this the Philippine-American War. Sometimes it's called the Philippine Insurrection. It lasts longer than the Spanish-American War did. And the leader of the Filipino revolutionaries, you see him pictured there on the left. His name is Emilio Aguinaldo. He is recognized as the first president of the Philippines, even though this Philippine insurrection is not successful. The U.S. is going to win this war. Aguinaldo is going to get captured, and he will swear an oath of allegiance to the U.S. So today the Philippines are an independent nation, and they recognize Aguinaldo as their first president. but it didn't really work out that way like it did in American history with George Washington. This was a bloody war. It was a guerrilla war. There was a lot of ambushes and raids. The U.S. launched a scorched earth campaign. So it was total war in the Philippines. All right, open door policy. This refers to China. So as we mentioned in the last video, China was ruled by a Manchurian dynasty called the Qing dynasty, but several European powers had gained influence in China. We had what was called those treaty ports. Hong Kong belonged to Great Britain. Westerners had the right of extraterritoriality. And so the open door policy was something initiated by the United States to ensure equal trade among these Westerners, but at the same time guarantee the territorial integrity of China. The idea that China would not be carved up, like we saw in that picture in the last video. China would not be carved up. China would remain whole as China, but Westerners would all exercise, certain privileges there. Now, that brings us to the Boxer Rebellion. So this takes place right after the Spanish-American War. This is the Boxer Rebellion, which happens in China. Now, here's the deal, okay? So remember, China is ruled by a Manchurian dynasty called the Qing dynasty. China is not ruled by Chinese people. It's ruled by Manchu people, okay? So today that's a little confusing because Manchuria is part of China, but think of it as two different ethnic groups. You have Manchu Chinese and you have Han Chinese, all right? So the most Chinese people are called Han, all right? But the ruling class during this time is the Manchus, the Qing dynasty, all right? So when we talk about this Boxer Rebellion, this is not a rebellion of Chinese people against the Qing dynasty. And it's not a war between the Qing dynasty and the West. It's a war between Chinese rebels, all right, Han Chinese rebels, and these Western nations that are in China. So we call it the Boxer Rebellion. It's sort of, there's an interesting triangle here, right, where the Chinese people are ruled by the Manchus. The Manchus have sort of submitted in some ways to the West, and now the Chinese rebels are fighting against the Western powers, right? So the Chinese people here that are fighting, we're going to call them the Boxers, all right? Now the word Boxers is really a Western name for these guys. They are using martial arts, which to the Western eyes in the late 1800s, would be boxing. If you're a British person and someone talks about someone fighting with their fists, you go, oh, boxing. You're talking about boxing. So that's why it's called the Boxer Rebellion. All right, so we have the Boxers, which are Chinese rebels, fighting against these Westerners who form what's called the Eight Nation Alliance. All right, so the Eight Nation Alliance is Austria-Hungary, Great Britain, Germany, France, Italy, Japan, Russia, and the United States. So remember, Japan is considered a Western nation. They're not Western in geography, but Western in their institutions, all right? They're industrialized, modern military, all that stuff, okay? So all of these nations, these 8 nations are fighting together on the same side, which is interesting, right? And they win, all right? It's the Eight Nation Alliance wins the war. The Boxers are punished. A lot of them are executed. But the Qing government is also punished because when this war happened, the Qing government, the Chinese government, did not step in to subdue the rebels. They were sort of hoping to benefit from this rebellion by maybe the rebels could beat the Western powers and then the Qing would reassume total control of China. So the Qing government is punished by being forced to pay damages to the 8 nations. Western powers are allowed to maintain troops in China, and there's further protections for foreign citizens like missionaries. Okay, so the last thing we'll talk about is the end of the McKinley administration, which happens with the death of President McKinley. So he is assassinated. All right, he is the 3rd president to be assassinated, preceded by Abraham Lincoln and James Garfield. So he was shot twice. The first shot just sort of grazed him. The second shot hit him in the stomach. He was shot on September 6th. He didn't die until September 14th, so he died from an infection. Similar to Garfield. Garfield obviously took longer to die, but he dies. And so his vice president is going to become president. We'll talk more about that in a later video, but that will be Theodore Roosevelt. The guy who shot him, Leon Czolgosz, he was a radicalized leftist. He was a worker. He was part of the working class, the proletariat. He was a radicalized leftist. So he had been listening to some speeches by some other Marxists, and he saw McKinley as a symbol of oppression and shot and killed the president. He was sentenced to death by electric chair in October of 1901. This assassination, as I mentioned, the third president to be assassinated, led to Secret Service protection for the president. So the Secret Service was already a part of the U.S. government, but this is when that branch of law enforcement was assigned to protecting the president. All right, so we'll end here. We will pick up the next video talking about the presidency of Theodore Roosevelt.